My name is Todd Miranda. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to enable controls using the validation of other controls. So let's take a look at what we're going to do is we'll do File, New, do a new project. Let's choose the WPF application and let's just name this something that makes sense and choose OK. So we're going with .NET 3.5 WPF, and this is WPF Service Pack 1, 3.5 Service Pack 1. We're going to work mainly in our XAML window. So let's get started, and let's just build just a very, very simple form with maybe a couple of fields in it and then a button. And the button will be the control that will enable or disable based on whether the data in our two text fields is valid. So let's just start. We're going to create a loaded event so that we can bind some data, and we'll just let Visual Studio create that handler for us. So let's go to our code behind, and I'm just going to go down here and create a new class directly in the file itself. So we're going to do public class, and let's just call this person, just to keep things fairly simple. And in our person class, we're going to have a couple of properties. Let's do a property for first name, and this will be a string. And we'll call this, or actually let's just call it name in general. So we'll just say name. And then we're going to do and I'm using the shortcut for creating a public property. I'm just typing in prop and hitting my tab key, and that takes me to a shortcut way to do this. Let's say that we're going to also do an int, and we'll call this age. All right, so there's our class. We've got a name and an age. So this will just make it easy to bind some data into our form. Why don't we go back to our XAML, and let's just again kind of make things simple. Let's just create a stack panel as our root element, and we'll name this, let's give it a name. Let's say enabled root. All right, we'll end our stack panel. Okay. So in our loaded event, we're going to create an instance of our person class, and then we'll just bind it directly to that root element, and then we'll bind all the controls to that. So we're going to set the data context to that root element to our instance of the class that we create. So let's just say that we're going to let's create a local variable, and we'll just call this, we'll do private type person, and we'll just call this local person. And we'll go down to our loaded event, and we'll say local person equals new person, and we'll say we're going to do name equals, and let's just say this is John Doe, and age equals, and we're going to say that John Doe is pretty old, so we'll say he's 340. All right, so he's quite a bit older, but that's okay. We don't mind. Maybe he's somebody that was dug up and they haven't identified him yet, so his age will show that. So now let's just do enabled root dot data context equals local person. All right, since we're doing a demo, we can have all kind of fun with things like that. All right, so there's our loaded event. Now we're also going to have a click event for our button, and that way we can actually watch to see if the button received the click event, just to prove that when we disable the button on the data validation, we're actually not getting a click event. So it's really just a kind of a way that we'll prove that to ourselves. But to get started with, let's go ahead and lay out some of our controls. So let's start with a text box, and we'll give this a name. We'll just say this is text name, and we're going to do a text equals All right, and we'll use binding syntax here, and we're just going to say this is bound to name. Since we set the data context to the stack panel, this will look up our tree and find the first thing that it could bind to, and that will be person, and it'll look for the name property. So maybe we'll also come in and just say we've got a width of 200, just to kind of limit things there. And let's see, maybe even we'll do horizontal alignment equals center, just to kind of keep it where we can see it. And then let's do another text box right beneath that. Let's do this. We're going to call this one text age, somewhat obviously, and bind also to age, and the same type of thing. We're going to change that in just a minute to blow out our binding a little bit. We're going to use property element syntax instead of property attribute syntax for that. So we're going to do a button, and no real need to actually, let's go ahead and name our button, and we're just going to call this button save, and perhaps it will be horizontal alignment equals center as well. And we need to do a click event again to kind of prove to ourselves that we're not getting a click event when we don't want it. And there we are. Let's do our content as well for our button. We'll just do that as property attribute content equals, and we'll do save. Maybe we'll do save data. Why not? Okay, so there's our pretty simple form. We've got a couple of text boxes. Maybe even in our age text box, we could do margin equals, and we could add some margin in here. So maybe we'll do margin 10, and that'll just move it down to give us a little bit of separation. We'll do the same margin here on another text box. Okay, that spaces everything out just a little bit more. Now let's go ahead and go back to our click event. And in our click event, why don't we go ahead and we'll just say that we're going to text name dot text. So we're going to override whatever's in there, and we'll say we're going to put in there button clicked. So this way we can keep an eye on whether our button was clicked or not. So very, very straightforward what we've done here. We've just created an instance of a class. We're going to bind that or set the data context of our root element to that so that all of our controls in there can then use the binding syntax just to bind up to that data context. And when we click the save button, we're going to just write something into our text box. This is really just used to indicate when the button was clicked. So we actually got a click event to our code behind. So now let's take the next step, and let's take our age text box, all right, and we're going to use property element syntax instead of property attribute syntax to do our binding. And that way we can specify a validator directly in markup for our binding validation on our age text box. Okay, so here we've got textbox.text, and inside there we're going to we'll do our binding. We're going to specify our path to be age, just like we had, similar to what we had before. And now we're going to specify some validation rules for this particular binding. So if you haven't looked at validation rules were introduced to allow us to, we have some default validation rules, but then you can create your own custom validation rules, and the validation is applied at the time that you attempt to bind the new value back to the original object. All right, so if you've got your binding or your update set as kind of a manual update, so you have more control over when that's updated, you won't see that binding validation rule won't get applied until you actually try to update the new value back to the original object. So that's when the binding validation rules are applied. And you can have more than one that you can apply to the same object. Binding validation is really a nice capability that if you haven't looked at, you should probably look at a little bit more. So we're going to do something fairly simple for our binding validation. We're going to do our binding dot validation rules. And in our binding validation rules, we're going to use one of the built-in validation rules, and that's an exception validation rule. So the exception validation rule is triggered anytime there's an actual exception. All right, so what we're going to do, since we've got age as an integer, we'll be able to very quickly create an exception by entering something that's not a number into our text box. And when that happens, we'll get an exception fired, and then our validation will fail. So a real simple way to test out the validation is just put an exception validation rule in there and do something that's going to cause an exception when you try to bind that data back to the original object, which happens to be our person object in this case. So here we go. We've got our age property, our validation rules, and we're using an exception validation rule. Now, what we want to happen is we want our button to be disabled if there's a validation rule. So this is a common scenario. We could reverse that actually, and we could say that we want the button to be disabled until all the text values are valid. So maybe you've got a username and a password type box, and your password is a required field, and you want to make sure that password is filled in before the login button is enabled. So we could obviously do this in code behind. Sure, we could write code to do that there, but it'd be nice to have this a little bit more toolable and to do it directly in the XAML, and that's really where we're headed with this particular example. Now, in order to do that, there's a really nice property that we can take a look at, and it is a property on the validation, and it has errors, or has error, and that indicates that a validation, one of X number of validations failed. The problem is the validation.hasError occurs on the element that's being validated. So while we have access in our button to the attached property validation.hasError, the button won't have a validation error. So that'll always be false. It will always be that it does not have an error. We really need to find a way to have our button take a look at the attached property validation.hasError on the actual text box element. So how do we do that? Well, we could do that with conditions. So we can do that in a target using conditions, and if we put a trigger directly on our button, we can only use event triggers. And this isn't an event trigger, this is a property trigger, so we need to do that in a style. So we could obviously do that as an inline style, but you typically won't want to use inline styles, so we would have a resources block with our style defined there. So let's do that. Let's go to window.resources. Alright, so in our resources we're going to have our first style. So let's do style, and we're going to say target type equals, and we'll use the kind of more correct way of doing this. We could have just typed in here button, but we'll specify the X type button, which is really a little bit more proper way to do that. And then we need to give it a key since we're in our resources block. So let's do key equals, and let's just call this single valid style. So there's our style block. Now in our style block, we want to set the triggers for our style. So style.triggers, and this is how we get around doing the property trigger as opposed to the event trigger, because you can have some other things besides an event trigger in a style. So that's the way we get around that. So we've got style.triggers. We're going to use a data trigger, and we're going to say that the binding for our data trigger is going to be binding. And remember that we need to find a way to get the validation.hasError on the actual text box element that we're interested in. So we're going to do element name to actually bind to the text age element. And then we're going to specify our path is equal to, since it's an attached property, we'll put it in parentheses, validation dot has error. Well, obviously I can't type today. All right. And then the value that we're looking for is true. So if our has error, the validation.hasError attached property on our element text age is true, which means it does have an error, then what do we want to do? We actually want to create a setter with the property of is enabled, and the value, we're going to set that to false to effectively disable our button. All right, so that should be fairly straightforward. We've created a triggers. We're using a data trigger. The binding for our data trigger, we're looking at the text age element, and we're looking at the attached property on that element called validation.hasError. When it's true, we want to disable the button. So that looks fairly straightforward. Let's go ahead and build this, see if we've missed anything. Build started. So far, so good. One succeeded. Good. Let's go ahead and execute this. So what we'll do is when our window loads, there we go, we've bound our person in there. We're going to go in and just change this to something that we know is going to cause an exception, because FASDF is definitely not an int. And as soon as we either tab or lose focus, as soon as the text box loses focus, it's going to try to bind that data back to the original object. So the nice thing is we don't have to hit tab. I'm going to click on the Save Data button. That's going to cause the text box first to lose focus, and then normally the click event would be fired. And if you remember, the click event is going to replace the text up here with a hard-coded string that we typed in if it gets the click event. So let's click on our Save Data. All right. So notice that we got our button clicked. All right. So that our events were kind of fired a little bit out of order, which is something that we want to try to avoid. So we could change the binding validation for our text box here in such a way that the validation occurs at the right time. So let's go and let's take a look at why we still got our clicked event when we tried to bind our data back to our object. So if we go down here, notice that in order to have our button actually utilize that style, we have to apply the style. So let's do static resource and specify our single. We'll just copy our style name. Okay, single valid style. Now that we've actually applied the style to our button, let's run this again and see if it makes a little bit of a difference. So now we're going to change our text to some value that will cause an exception. Now we click Save Data. So now notice that our button is disabled. We do not get the text applied to our first text box, which means the click event did not happen. So the great part about that is our validation rule was applied, the button was disabled prior to the click event firing, so we didn't have to worry about tabbing out of that text box before we clicked the button like we would have had to have done before without that style. All right? So fairly straightforward what we've got there now. I think that what we're seeing and how that works. The question might be, so what happens if I want to validate both of our text boxes? Well, it's pretty much the same thing. So let's just take and we'll copy this style. There is one slight difference, and that's why we'll take a look at this. Let's call this multi-valid style. So now, if you want to check multiple values, remember that the data triggers is effectively an AND. So we want to make sure that they all come back as true in order to do our setter. All right, so we can't check to see if they're all true before we do our setter to enable it false, because if just one of them was true or one of them was false, we might not get the value. We may not get the behavior that we're looking for. So what we need to do is we need to create a multi-trigger, and the first thing we need to do is set the button to be disabled, and then we'll go in and enable it if all the values don't have any errors. So let's take a look at what we're looking at there. So in our multi-valid style, in our style.triggers, right, we're going to set a multi-data trigger, and the multi-data trigger will have conditions. So we've got our multi-data trigger dot conditions, and our conditions will look a little bit like this. This is going to be a condition, and our binding will still be the same thing. We're going to text age, validation.hasError, except the value that we're looking for is false. So we're going to look in this situation for a condition where the element does not have an error. And let's add another one of those conditions, except this time we're going to do element name text name, validation.hasError equals false. Okay, so we no longer need this data trigger. All right, so once all the conditions are met, then we're going to set the setter property equals is enabled, value equals true. So the difference here is we're actually going to turn the button, we're going to enable the button if all the conditions, if all the elements don't have errors. So the first thing we need to do in our style is come in and do setter property equals is enabled, value equals false. So there's the difference. We're going to come into our style, we're going to disable the button, and then we're only going to enable the button again once we make sure that all of the elements do not have errors. So let's take our multi-valid style, let's change that in our button to be multi-valid style. Now granted, we don't have a validation rule on our text box, which means that we should always have a validation that has errors of false, but that's still going to check the validation of both text boxes. Again, we're going to enter some invalid data here, click our save data, and we get the disabled button, the exact same behavior that we had before, except now we're testing for both text boxes to be valid. So you could do that for as many elements as you wanted to include in your trigger, and that way you could use triggers in your style to check the validation of the validation state of all the controls that you were interested in, and enable or disable other controls based on that.